Good morning, everybody. My name's Scott Power. I'm the Director of the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences here at the University of Southern Queensland. And the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences has approximately 56 people formally affiliated with the centre. And that includes around about 20 staff, around about 20 PhD students, and then over a dozen so-called climate mates who we employ, and they live right across northern Australia, and they're champions in the use of meteorological and climate information in decision making in the cattle industry. And most of the staff we have in the centre are located in southeast Queensland, but we also have some staff at the Bureau of Meteorology and in England at the UK Met Office. But before we proceed, I'd like to, on behalf of the centre, acknowledge the traditional owners on the various lands on which we're meeting, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it's my great pleasure and honour to introduce this morning's speaker, Associate Professor Ben Lyons. And Ben is the founding director of the Rural Economy Centre of Excellence, and that's a major program funded by the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries that includes University of Queensland, University of Southern Queensland, James Cook University and Central Queensland University. And Ben, in that centre, leads a diverse team of experienced researchers investigating Queensland's rural and regional communities. And Ben has a PhD in specialising in export value chains, and he got that from the University of Queensland. And at one part of his career, one stage in his career, he was the CEO of a company. And so today I'd like to now just introduce the topic. Ben's going to be telling us about a project which is funded by the Future Drought Fund, which is looking at the challenges and opportunities for regions to become better prepared for drought. And one other very interesting part of Ben's career is that he spent 20 years or so in Asia, primarily in China, and he's fluent in Mandarin. So we thought that it might be interesting from here on that the entire presentation will be in Mandarin. Ni hao, Ben.
Ni hao. Yeah, thanks, Scott. And yes, doing it in Mandarin would be a challenge. Anyway, but yes, my first actual morning, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. And thanks to CACS. I have a great time working with CACS colleagues over the year, my short time at USQ. So humbled a little bit to do a talk to you guys, because I'm normally asking you guys all the questions and you have more answers. So it is a great pleasure to be here. And yeah, so actually my original first degree was in Chinese literature. And I did that in China in the 90s and became a translator for my sins. And then I got into agriculture and ag economics via that. So it wasn't a very linear route towards ag economics or economics now, or what do we do in RECoE as sort of regional and rural economics. But anyway, enough about that. Today I'm just going to talk because I think it's related very much. We've relied and worked with a lot of CACS colleagues. I see Kate Reardon-Smith and Dave and Rod, you know, your predecessor, Scott, Roger, and a lot of these, a couple of these Future Drought Fund projects, and one of them, which we're talking about today, has been this state-led or state government sort of level part of the 8th program, which is Regional Drought Resilience Planning. And it's been a really interesting project for the last, you know, we're coming into our 10th month. I think we were contracted finally in August last year to start. And now we're heading into our second phase of that project. I'll share what I was thinking of doing was having, you know, talking for sort of 20 or 30 minutes, maybe 25 minutes, and then, you know, leave you with some questions that we've had around our project, because I think, I know myself, I can only probably have an attention span of 20 minutes, and then I'd rather get into some discussion. So I'll try, and if that's okay with the powers that be, with Will and Louis and Scott, then that's sort of how I structure it. So I will share screen for a little bit, so bear with me, colleagues, and hopefully you can see these slides as they come up. And please give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the slides as they should be. Is that right? Oh no, I haven't pressed share.
Ben, it's coming up now, but just to interrupt, just to let people know, if they have any questions during the talk, please enter them through the Q&A facility. And then, as Ben alluded to, we'll have a Q&A session where everyone can have raise their questions verbally in the last 15 minutes or so. Thanks a lot, Ben.
So just to check, are you guys seeing my emails or are you seeing my actual slides?
Seeing your folders.
Folders. Now then we're seeing what's that?
There we go. Yeah, I can see that. Thank you.
No worries. So yeah, I'll fly through these. There's not actually 35 slides. That's just to scare you. So we've already done that acknowledgement. Thank you, Scott. This is actually just one small thing. These pictures, a lot of we use are from a now Glenmorgan, Western Downs based cattle musterer or helicopter cattle musterer, Scott Bridle. His mother and sister are quite famous artists or very successful artists in the region, but if you ever are short of images, he's just doing a new batch of these aerial. So he does some mustering and some photography, and on the side, and I think actually his biggest contract at the moment is shooting feral pigs for DAF. But anyway, does some great imagery of Queensland and Northern Australia in particular. So as Scott and others have mentioned, sort of we're 4 universities. We're in our 4th year of existence. We have an original DAF, Department of Ag, contracts where we're looking, because DAF used to have has rural communities as part of their remit. So we're looking at how rural communities sustain. We did that across a range of different projects, and economic analysis, regional innovation. Often the regional, or all our regional innovation is done more at a regional level, not enterprise level. So we never went straight into that enterprise level, sort of working with stuff on farm and different gadgets and widgets and things like that. We're more about, when we talk regional innovation, we talk about how a region organises itself to attract entrepreneurs or build up entrepreneurs and so forth. Value chains, which is a really key one for us, led by CQ University. So we did one in beef consumer trends, particularly looking at credence factors there, animal welfare, environmental offsets and things like that, what that meant, horticulture ownership models and aquaculture's potential. We also did a 4th project with DAF on sheep meat, and particularly in South and Central Western Queensland. And then our 4th key area has been policy and governance, doing a lot of that economic and those other aspects, turning those into some policy recommendations for DAF. DAF, just so you know, we're really keen on becoming more of a policy leading or policy creating department, as opposed to a policy taking department. A lot of DAF's time as the Department of Agriculture in recent history has been dominated. For example, the Vegetation Management Act is controlled by the Department of Environment and Science. There's even a few drought things they work well with DES on, and not so well in others. So really RECoE's reason for entry has been to give them a bit of a policy think tank capability. Also, a lot of our work, we weren't set up as a theoretical, pie in the sky type of blue sky thinking think tank. We're really about applied or creating material and translating that material for regions. So that's been a real key sort of persona of our centre. We're not so much about publications, but about engagement with people in region, doing workshops with them, building capability both at a leadership, say a mayor, CEO level, and at an economic development level, and also helping a lot of regional organisations that are not government or NGOs. So, for example, Chad Renando yesterday facilitated 2 workshops in the Burnett region, looking at their Burnett Inland Futures sort of report that he's done in the last sort of 12 months. So that's a lot of sort of the work of what we do. I have this picture here, for example, another project we finished this year where I actually led for AGL, and this is at the moment Australia's biggest wind farm in Cooper's Gap. Has a lot of community. It's a great renewables project, for example, but understanding that impact on the immediate community around, the farmers that are around, these turbines, and that impact, and the impact, positive and negative on both 2 local government areas that split this wind farm is split across. This wind farm's there's 122 of these towers. There were 123. They had to destroy one for the first time in the world. But that's been done. I did have footage of that, but I can't show it. It took about 6 months. Interesting project. But there's a lot of consternation, and there's now another 2 wind farms planned for this area immediately behind this one, to the west and to the north. And then there's also what will be the next biggest it's a bit like Max Smart on Get Smart, isn't it? Like, that's not the biggest solar gun I've seen. It's the second biggest. Anyway, I'm digressing. But there's a big wind farm in McIntyre and Gundawindi and Southern Downs as well that's going in. And just how these projects are delivered, I mean, we're looking at 110-metre tall towers there. That turbine at the top is 90 tonnes worth of, you know, basically a machine, a gearbox. And then you've got 67-metre propellers, you know, or blades, which are carbon fibre. How do we, you know, what's the life of, you know, this has been great for some. What we've been analysing is the economic impact, how they could do the community engagement better. You know, these farms are now, instead of paying the normal $6,000 a year in rates, they're paying $27,000 per turbine. Who pays for that? Well, obviously AGL are paying for it. So we've just been doing a lot of analysis on things like that. And that's been a really big topic in Queensland, and particularly regional Queensland, and particularly in our area, because we have one of the big energy things. But I'm digressing. I'm just showing you sort of what our work can be done. Because of that work, we sort of, like, you know, in our first exposure to the Future Drought Fund came with our dear colleague, you as dear colleagues, and particularly Kate and Dave, Shabazz and co, around the drought resilient leaders. And then last year we got approached by DAF because each state is getting funding to do these regional drought resilience plans. Queensland over time has been the largest recipient of drought subsidy fundings. We'd been involved with a Red Cross projects in 2019 to 2020, leading into 21, as well as DAF being the policy holder for drought in the state. So last year they said, well, look, we'll embark on a project with you guys. The complication, you know, and we're obviously very interested. This is one of your own graphics around, you know, particularly, you know, fast droughts, or, you know, flash droughts, as Roger, or I can't remember, it was the UK, the US came up with that thing. But you guys, you know, we felt we had a great knowledge base that you guys provide, but also we could do that regional engagement. A complication for our projects was that we weren't just dealing with the Future Drought Fund and the State Agricultural Department, but we were dealing with Queensland Reconstruction Authority, because under the Future Drought Fund guidelines, we had to have state co-funding. So the state quite creatively said that their current Resilience Queensland project, which is done in all these regions around the state by the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, mainly looking at flood and bushfire, would be their co-funding, and that we comply with their program. So hence, when I talk about the regions we've done regional drought plans for, and why you think they're a bit strange, because we had to follow these Queensland Reconstruction Authority regions, which divide the state into 14. And there's some issues with that, which are outlined there. You know, the data sources don't necessarily match up. They definitely don't match up with ABARES. They don't match up with ABS. They don't match up with Queensland's own sort of statistician's office in many cases. So that's been a challenge. We decided to do 5 pilot regions at the start of our project. So we've highlighted them there. We were going to sort of put them into 2 different groups, start one early and then feed into the other 3, but we pretty much started them all at the same time. So James Cook Uni did the Cape, and also Burdelin and Mackay with UQ. CQU did Fitzroy, Capricornia, and USQ did the Darling Downs in Southwest. We added South Burnett into the Darling Downs and South Burnett, Southwest sort of area at the behest of AgForce. But that has proven to be statistically, for an analytical, for social reasons, they're very aligned in the South Burnett. They're very similar to the Darling Downs in many ways. But statistically, and how the state is typically governed horizontally. So that's why they're included in the Wide Bay Burnett, which we can talk about later as well. So each of those regions, we also had to have a local partner, or sort of a co-signer, or someone that was, and I'll talk about this a lot, someone that would own these regional drought plans. So in the north, we did it with a group of Indigenous councils. Burdelin and Charters, we did with both local governments. Fitzroy, Capricornia, we did with the Central Queensland Regional Organisation of Councils, so all the councils in the FitzCap. And in Darling Downs, we did with Regional Development Australia. We don't have what they call a ROC, or Regional Organisation of Councils. We do have a sort of council of like a group of mayors that meet twice a year, but we don't have this sort of that CQ rock structure. So there's a learning for the federal government and for FDF. Every region will have a different sort of layer of what you call pan-regional governance. You can't, when you talk about a region and one LGA, you're talking to one LGA. So it's very hard, and federal governments and state governments like talking government to government, but in regional development terms, that can be problematic. Is one learning we'd sort of want to highlight there. Our plan of attack was really, we do the research and look around the best practice. We go and see the CACS guys, we go and see the long paddock guys, we get data around these regions. We go and interview a lot of people in the region, get their existing plans and what they've done in the past. We look at what some new and inventive ideas have been, and then we look at some agreeing on some pathways and priorities with that region. And that's how we sort of come up with a drought plan. We had a lot of governance in this project. I wouldn't have been able to do it without a really good project management consultancy that had worked in QRA, so that we weren't always looking over our shoulder at what the QRA people or the Queensland Reconstruction Authority might want to say. We also had the federal department, who we didn't have much direct contact with, thankfully. We worked very closely with the state and Vern Rudwick and Nicole Peters in DAF, and that was really good. But I would say it's been at the start particularly, it was a very top-heavy governance project. We did a lot of meetings and things, and I wouldn't have been able to do it with that project sort of management of the Yellow Company, which has been sort of Ben Norling, Emma and Robert from the Red Cross project, but particularly Ben and Emma in terms of helping with the engagement, coordination, overall project management. Robert provided sort of technical advice particularly on community. We had to liaise with a few other FDF projects, but intermittently, but really it's been this core sort of group in here. And then we also had to coordinate the actual delivery of the 5 plans themselves, which is with each 5 regions. And one of the key things we did in each region to show that we weren't being extractive and flying in, FIFO academics, if you like, was we had a bit like Climate Mates, we had an on-the-ground regional facilitator, whether they were embedded in an organisation, a standalone consultant. We had used the same one for Darling Downs and Southwest, which is Gundawindi-based Julia Spicer, or some people would remember as Julia Telford. And then each of the other regions had their own. We had Mark Marty up north, we had Matt McIntyre and Emerald, and we had we actually employed one of the Takika people in the Cape to help with that delivery. So I did a lot of engagement, relatively speaking. So over 275 sort of activities, particularly in those regions. And I think that's really, obviously it's an obvious thing to state, but we had a real methodology around asking our questions. We often met with one person or one of these sort of 33 or 25 or 42 individuals more than once, because we went early and we came back with our reflections, draft plans and other questions. We held a lot of online webinars and Zoom calls like this, where we talked a little bit, provoked a question and then got their feedback. So we did that with a lot of bodies like, Ag Forces Livestock Committee, QFF and some horticulture views and things like that. One of the real things you need to worry about in a project like this is engagement fatigue. It's pretty much why we didn't do Central West and Longreach, because everyone was going there. Drought resilient leaders in the FDF project were going there. And we spoke to people on the ground there. They said, "Oh, look, we haven't really got time. We're busy, blah blah blah." The other thing was I could do some rainfall maps and things like that of the last 6 months. But I think you'd all get the picture, and particularly in like Gundy and Inglewood late last year with their flooding. So this was something Julia texted through to me one morning saying, "Yeah, I'm heading out to talk about drought." And that's floodwaters across her road out the front of her place in Gundy. So yeah, that engagement fatigue and how you engage in a meaningful way and something that's not extractive, that actually gets that genuine buy-in from regional stakeholders is really key. You really have to work hard on that stuff, as a lot of you guys would already know and do. Drought impacts. So some of the examples we've got, these are mainly lifted from Darling Downs and Southwest. What are the impacts? And we looked at everything from a lens of 4 sort of attributes, which I'll go into in a moment. And you know, this is sort of pretty typical. When our process was looking at what the impact on people, culture, and community was in drought, what the impact on the economy was, what the impact on landscape and natural environment was, and what the impact on built environment and infrastructure was. And what we wanted to do was go through this. There's a few different processes. You know, CSIRO have their own one called Raptor. We're not that rapt in Raptor. Hope there's no CSIRO people on here, but I think CSIRO do great hard science. I'm not so sure about the social science stuff or the soft science. Anyway, just one thing. We'd had experience with Raptor in another project, and it didn't go so well. So our methodology was really driven by this Crossman work, which was done for the UN and in other sort of countries, but around drought resilience, adaptation and management, where he just sort of, because we could observe all these things around those through the lens of those 4 topics, but then how do we put this into a plan? And how do we put it into a plan that relates to people in a region? How do we put it into a plan that we can look back on and say, well, we've done that, we haven't done that? And that's, and always you're asking this existential question, if you like, are we actually doing anything that's helping these regions be better prepared or, you know, do better in drought coming forward? And that's sort of, you have to keep going back to that question. Are we actually doing anything here? And it often went beyond drought. Like you could swap out, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. You could swap out drought and talk about, well, we did it last week, talk about decarbonisation. You could swap out drought and talk about workforce, you know, but drought sort of is one of those things that magnify all of those underlying issues in a rural community, and challenges are magnified by drought. So we sort of had to remember that, but remember these are ongoing issues. So remember we're trying to produce plans that are getting money, investment money from the FDF and other sources going into these regions really effectively. So we needed this sort of go through all this thinking and storming around what a framework would look like. And this DRAMP one for us was probably the most elegant in terms of its simplicity, ability to be understood by people on the ground, and one we could put some rigor behind for government investment. This is an example of what we did, you know, that approach, and this is really the high level one that each plan now did. And that was the other thing, we'll talk about that in a minute, but everyone did this a little bit differently. And that was a beauty of our design. We wanted that intentionally. We didn't all want to be cookie cutter drought plans. That didn't reflect regional engagement or what the regions were. You've been to one region, you've been to one region. So we had to keep that difference. And also they don't even use the word drought in the Cape York. They just use longer dry seasons, shorter wet seasons, you know, or that cycle. They don't have the word drought. They have the impacts related to those longer dry seasons that are similar to, say, the Fitzroy Cap, but they don't have that language of drought as we know it down here. We talk about it differently. So really we're trying to uncover what was the personality of drought in these regions and in these communities. What did it mean? You know, what's a drought mean in Charleville? And the different types of drought. You know, a lot of people say in the Southwest talked about learning about the Federation drought helped them to cope with the millennial drought and things like that. So I won't go through these bit by bit, but this is sort of like, you know, a 3-pillared approach of like, we're going to do some planning and monitoring and understanding the impact of drought. That's still relatively underdone, if you believe. We don't really know the economic costs of drought. We can sort of, and some would argue that the economic costs of terms of trade or our trade, you know, the value of our wheat, you know, cereal, red meat or other things has a bigger impact on our regions than drought does. That's an argument. But yeah, these are sort of some of what our plans look like. Obviously going into more detail, you would have sort of the priority, you know, one left of what the purpose of doing it and the action. Then we'd also sort of have a measurement of how we're going with putting those things in. Darling Downs and South Perth, we did a really big lot of spreadsheets around this and in detail. And we also, as you can see here, and this is one just on the, you know, this is just the top little piece of, say, 15 or so goals we've done for people, culture and communities. But we sort of cut them back to 5 for each of the 4 because there'd be too many otherwise. It'd be completely unmanageable. So we're trying to also cut that down and prioritise them. And at the moment, we're going through with each region to get, is this right? You reckon this is top of the list or not? So that's sort of a constant engagement piece. And I won't go through, but each of the regions, you know, did a similar, had a similar, we probably formatted a little bit differently, and we probably had different pathways and a few different, you know, topics of what we look at. So challenges for this project, and I'm winding up. is the regional consistency and plan variance. Whilst we believe in it, it probably kept coming back to us from DAF and FDF. It's like, oh, they don't, and we're waiting for CSIRO, who are going to be the independent assessor of these projects or these plans. And now they have them at the moment. And another real key thing for us was how these plans would be implemented. If I go back to that, engagement fatigue thing, another planning process from the government, fantastic. And what you're getting a university to do it, even better. So, the cynic and particularly some mayors that have been around a long time would say, oh, this isn't going to go anywhere. So, Queensland Reconstruction Authority in their process had a really big carrot. They had millions of dollars to spend on flood damage. We had nothing. We couldn't get that message from FDF as to why these regions are doing it. Oh, they're going to get some money. It's like, well, how much and what? They're a bit cynical, So that's a real issue for FDF. And we said that a lot. Said you've got to give these, we're buying these, we're wearing these people out with the engagement that leads to nothing for them and distracts from their day job. Not every region has a rap ad with Dave Arnold and his great structure of it. And even he gets worn out by these processes. So anyway, it's sort of, that's one of the learnings we've got to manage up a little bit, but also really very real one for regional leaders and practitioners. Owning the plans is a real issue. FDF actually came back to us in their first ever feedback back in January this year and said, oh, by the way, do we know who owns these plans? And we're like, well, that's our sort of original question, because if you own a plan, if Scott Power owns a plan, then he's got to deliver that plan. So Scott Power would like the resources to deliver that plan. So would Goondiwindi Regional Council, or or Belong, or or Paru, whatever. We need to, if these people are going to have, they need to get some funding to deliver, or they have the ownership. So there's a big reputational risk for some of these regional organisations that we also had to manage. And this plan ownership, maybe it's the state. The state is the policy owner for drought. Maybe they should own it, because they have the resourcing, they have the overall side of a few different portfolios of things, and they can they do the coordination. So should it stay with the state? We haven't recommended either way at this stage, but we have highlighted a few of the challenges of what they've done. And this plan assessment, going through CSIRO and stuff, I think it's overkill. But anyway, that's just me. Some of the opportunities we've learned a lot, in terms of influencing, regions can be really proactive in owning their own drought sort of responses and getting investment that they can have a say over. I think that's really important. We've proposed another stage that these projects don't just end in June 30 or what's just past the first 5. We propose that we move, we stay in region, and we've got some funding for our regional bodies. Hopefully $300,000 each region to employ someone to help with implementation. That's not us, that's someone in that region. Again, it could be the regional facilitator or so on. Each region will decide that. And so that leads into that continuity in regions. We think there's continuing work. As I said before, we could replace drought with decarbonisation, with workforce issues, education and skilling, or, insert sort of issue here. This sort of what we've come up with as a process of engagement and project management, we think could be really useful going forward. And it stops that, what I call in regional development terms, and particularly government responses to regional issues, they're just one continuous process of discontinuity. With a 1, 2, 3 year project here, we'll offer Julia a big lot. Gundy, we got thousands of dollars we can give you. Oh, it's actually not that much. We're going to stop that. We've got this nice, shiny, bright thing here. So that's really worn regions out, we think. Some reflections, a lot of data, and you guys deal with data and create a lot of great data. There is a lot of data gaps still, so it might be something interesting, particularly for the CACS people in the audience, that would see, and you'd probably have your own views on this. But as novices, somewhat, amateurs compared to you guys in the drought and climate space, we found that data and translating that to a regional sort of narrative was challenging. It was doable, but challenging. It could be better. The target audience plan, this sort of observation around evaporation pans, which is an Andrew Drysdale favourite, but in an age where we think we're measuring everything, to an nth degree, we perhaps may not be. We've sort of invested less. And again, this is more Scott Power and climate scientist sort of space, but it's something we sort of observed. We found a lot of a tertiary or an output out of this that has been like, well, we've seen it as an opportunity to renew, and the state's already on this journey of renewing or evolving how they do regional drought coordination. We found that a real coordination problem exists, and we've sort of got a bit of a paper on what we see have been some of the issues in the past, and what we see how we could do it in sort of drought regional coordination, regional drought coordination partnerships that could be done better. That sort of graphic, which you can't see, the thing, there are 34 policies accessible by either enterprises, like, you know, on the ground farmers, or governments for drought funding of some sort, either subsidies, grants, such a 34, and they're all there. So there's plenty of money for drought. But if you talk to someone on the ground, it's like, well, I don't know about that. I don't know how to do that. I can't recite these 34, and I've been working in this for 12 months, but that's how, you know, and I can't do it. So this lack of coordination around policy, and again, going back to my sort of mantra, one continuous process of discontinuity. We don't accumulate in regional development terms or in regional policy terms. We seem to stop and invent something. We Pol Pot it instead of evolve it. So those are some of the observations. I won't talk about regional carbonisation, but that's some of the, you know, things. I've got some other backup slides here that I thought might be interesting, but I think I'm pretty much will end there, which is supposed to be regional drought, not decarbonisation. That was last week's talk. But anyway, I'll finish there, and I'll stop sharing if you like, Professor Power and Will and Louis and co, and go over to you. And I hope that was somewhat sensical, or somewhere between, you know, thrilling and exciting.
Thanks very much, Ben. That was great, really important.